you pick it up really quick, so that's good. Open your Bibles, if you would, over to Mark chapter 8, if you would, please. Or let's do this. So Luke chapter 9. Let's go to Luke chapter 9. You know, when Jesus walked the roads of Galilee, he did not invite people to come and to admire him, certainly not to admire him from a distance. He didn't come and ask people to even agree with him. He didn't ask them to come and visit him once a week and check him out or anything like that. His invitation was really a pretty simple invitation, and it's one that he used quite often. And that invitation was simply, follow me. It sounds fairly simple, and yet when you talk about following after Jesus, there's meaning behind that idea of following. There certainly is a cost in following after him. When Jesus would ask people to follow him or say, follow me, he made that invitation 13 different times in the New Testament. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, it's scattered across there, but he often would come up to, say, like Peter and say, follow me. Andrew, follow me. Over in Matthew, the 9th chapter, in verse 9, I believe, that he told Matthew, who was a tax gatherer, follow me. He didn't try to convince them. He didn't try to overpower them with his knowledge or with his personality or his character. He simply came up to them and said, follow me. And in many cases, they just got up and followed. Peter, he left his nets. James and John left their nets and followed. Matthew, the tax gatherer, when Jesus said, follow me, it was a simple invitation. And it says that Matthew closed up shop, folded up his books, and he followed him. There wasn't a lot of discussion involved in it. Generally, when we think of being a follower of Jesus Christ, the word that we often use, probably predominantly, is the word Christian. And yet it might surprise you to know that the word Christian is not one that is used very often. In fact, it's extremely sparse. It's only used 3 times. It is used once in Acts, the 11th chapter, in verse 26, where Luke recorded Paul going to Antioch, and he says, and the disciples were first called Christians in Antioch. The disciples were first called Christians. The next time you see it is over in Acts chapter 26 and verse 28. And there Agrippa has been talking to Paul, and he says, Paul, you almost convinced me or persuade me to become a Christian. Some have said that this word Christian was used in a negative kind of connotation. I don't know if that's really true or not. For instance, when they called the Christians, the first Christians in Antioch, they saw it was more of a mocking kind of thing. I don't know as I completely buy that or not. The last time it is used, Peter uses it over in 1 Peter, the 4th chapter, and verse 16. And there he says, if anyone suffers because they are a Christian. The word Christian simply means a Christ follower. That's all it really means. But it's not the one that Jesus used predominantly, nor the writers used predominantly. In fact, the word that is used predominantly to describe one who would follow after Jesus was that of being a disciple. Now that word, that's a word that's used quite often. In fact, it's used 272 times as a disciple, and then it's used another 3 times as disciples. And so a disciple or disciples was the predominant use of one who followed after Jesus Christ. The word disciple, in terms of its meaning, comes from the Greek word mathetes, and it simply means a learner or an apprentice. In the first century, in Jesus' day, when rabbis would call their followers or men to be disciples, such as John had his disciples, Jesus called 12 men to be disciples of his or apostles of his, but he called hundreds, if not thousands, of individuals to be disciples of his. And so that word disciple meant one who was a learner. In fact, oftentimes when you attach yourself to a teacher, to be a disciple of theirs, you end up living with them. You lived with your teacher. You watched them, you learned from them, you changed your ways, and slowly you would become like your teacher. And that's important because when you talk about being a disciple, you're not really talking about gathering information. Obviously, that's part of it. You're gathering information, you're learning more and more about Jesus, but it's not so much about gathering information as it is about transformation. And that's what teachers tried to do with their disciples. They tried to mold them and make them. They tried to teach them by word, but they modeled to them. They showed them the example of how to live their lives. And the idea was that that disciple eventually become like their teacher, and that's what Jesus did. As he walked with his disciples, and in particular the 12, he modeled his life before them. He taught them, but the idea was to transform them to be like him so that they were able to carry out the same message that he was with. And so many people who followed after the disciple wanted to be like their disciple. Many people, they know a lot about Jesus. In fact, if you were just to talk to a Christendom at large and ask them about Jesus, they could tell you a lot of information about Jesus, but when you talk to them about this transformation process where we go from just thinking about Jesus and conversing about Jesus and sharing information about Jesus, we're able to look at how Jesus is shaping our lives. He's shaping the way we think. We talked about that some this morning, but shaping the way we think, shaping the way we speak and the way we talk to one another, shaping the way we respond to the various circumstances and things that goes on in our lives, shaping the way we live our lives. So a discipleship is this lifelong journey that we've been called into, becoming more and more like Jesus. Over in John the 8th chapter in verse 31, Jesus said, "If you continue in my word, then you are truly disciples of mine." Notice there's several things. And number one, he says that we are to continue. And secondly, we are to continue in his word. And by doing so, he knows the transformation process is going to become who we are. And that in turn is going to transform the way our lives. And people will know us then as disciples of Jesus. So Jesus said, if you continue in my word, then you are truly disciples of mine, which tells us what? Well, number one, it tells us that the word is extremely important as we talked about this morning. It's important that we adhere ourselves to the standard of Jesus' word, because what did Jesus say? I am the way, the truth, and the life. Not a truth, not one of the truths that are out there, but he says, I am the truth, the one and only truth. And that certainly is countercultural, not only in Jesus' day, but certainly in ours as well. So a disciple is not only one that adheres to his word, but a disciple is one who continues. It's not a one-time decision that we make that we're going to be a follower of his, but we're going to continue. That means not quitting. That means not drifting. That means not treating it as a phase of our lives, but as the completeness of our lives as we come to become these people who are transformed by Jesus. And Jesus never called people without there being a cost. He let us know that, listen, if you decide that you're going to follow after me, there is going to be a cost involved. And that brings us to Luke chapter 9 and verse 23. Luke chapter 9 and verse 23. And he was saying to them all, I think in Mark's gospel, in the 8th chapter and verse 34, it says he called his disciples to himself along with the crowd, okay? And so this is the same scene. It says, and he was saying to them all, that's disciples and those who are not disciples, if anyone wishes to come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whosoever wishes to save his life shall lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's shall save it. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and to lose or forfeit himself? So in that section, he talks about this cost of following after Jesus. So what does it mean to deny yourself? Well, to deny yourself, he's not talking about thinking poorly of yourself. What he is talking about, it means to stop putting yourself at the center, and that Jesus now becomes the center of our lives. And that's why when we make a confession, the good confession, that Jesus is Lord, that's huge when you think about it, because what you're saying is no longer am I the Lord of my life, no longer am I the master of my life, but Jesus now is the Lord of my life. Now Jesus is the master of my life, and now I'm following his direction. I'm following his cues. So disciples begin when Jesus moves from being an option in our lives to being the Lord of our lives. Secondly, notice he talks about taking up a cross. Today, we very easily can talk about taking up our cross, but in that day, that was the real deal. That day, they were very familiar with crucifixions and how Romans crucified criminals and people of that nature. They knew that it was serious stuff. So when he talked about, denying yourself and taking up your cross, and Luke in his record says that you're to pick up your cross daily. So it's a daily thing where we choose a daily choice that we're going to be obedient, even when it's difficult. And you have to agree with me that there are times when being a follower of Jesus can be extremely challenging. It can be difficult to trust him, even when it's uncomfortable, even when his teaching is uncomfortable, even when he's asking us to do things that are hard. Think about words like, going the extra mile. Think about turning the other cheek. Think about praying for your enemies. That's not easy stuff. It may be easy things to talk about and to preach, but then to flesh it out and to practice it in our lives, it becomes a super challenge. To remain faithful, wouldn't it be easier just to walk away, just to quit? I don't like the way the preacher dresses. I don't like the sermons that he preaches. I don't like the elders' decisions. I don't like the song leader. I don't like the color of the pews. There are so many things to not like about the church at times. But it's overwhelming when it comes to all the things that there are to like. I remember talking with one of my doctors. I'd studied with him. He and I became friends, and he was talking to me about medical life and how he goes, I don't know how anybody can be a doctor and not believe in God. And then he said, in the first school year of medical school, he goes, they teach you all the different things and all the ways to keep people alive. And in the second year, they told you all the ways that could get you dead, that people died. And he goes, and let me tell you, he goes, there's a million more ways to die than there are to keep you alive. That we are a miracle in the fact that we are upright and still moving with all the things that come at us in this life that we are able to endure. And that's the same way when it comes to being a Christian. There's so many things that come at us that can take us out, but there's some really good reasons for staying strong. And so picking up your cross means that, listen, life is not going to be easy for you. If you decide to follow after Jesus Christ, understand some things here. I think one of the first things is to understand that the people that are around you, the preacher that stands before you, that, I was not crucified for you. And no one in here died for you. But Jesus did. And so that's why to pick up our cross, you have to keep your focus on who Jesus Christ is. Here's the third thing. Following Jesus is not passive. It means that you have to choose his path, even when it runs against the culture, even when it rubs against public opinion, even when it comes to personal conveniences. All those things wrap up in the fact that it is not a passive kind of thing. Listen, if you decide that you're going to be a follower of Jesus, you're going to live a countercultural life. That means that there are things that are in jeopardy. Relationships can be in jeopardy because of it. Occupations can be in jeopardy because of it. A lot of things flow into that when you decide that Jesus is going to be the Lord of your life. All you have to do is go back in history, and it's not that long ago, but go back in history and look at all the apostles who decided that they're going to follow after Jesus. All of them died because of the cross of Jesus Christ. So when Jesus said, deny yourself and take up your cross, those guys, they were incredible men. And all of us, hopefully in here this evening, thinking to ourselves, I hope I have the same measure of faith that would cause me to stand strong like they stood strong. And like all those Christians who found themselves in persecution for the first 4 centuries of being a Christian, that we could stand strong even against culture, even against public opinion, even when it comes down to personal convenience. Then, of course, Jesus also made it clear that discipling shows itself over time. For instance, in his commandment, a new commandment I give to you, that you are to love one another, even as I have loved you. So I want you to love one another. By this will all men know that you are my disciples. How we love each other, how we lovingly forgive one another, how we lovingly serve one another. This love reflects Christ in our lives, even in the hard relationships that we have with one another. So disciples are marked by by love. In John the 15th chapter, in verse 8, he says, by this my Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit, and so prove to be my disciples. Of course, over the years, we've discussed what does it mean to produce the fruit. What is the fruit that he is talking about? And there are years when preachers would use this as a way of kind of twisting it a little bit, that maybe you ought to be reproducing yourselves and making other Christians. But the truth is that we don't produce branches. Christians are branches. Branches, we bear fruit, okay? And so it's not talking about evangelism. However, we are to bear fruit, and if we're bearing the fruit of love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness and faithfulness and self-control, if we are producing that kind of fruit, then there are going to be people who are come within our sphere that's going to be picking the fruit from our lives that will change their lives and bring them closer to Jesus Christ. So Jesus said that you bear much fruit, and so prove to be my disciples. So disciples' life bears fruit through our character, through our deepening faith, through our quiet power of influence that we have on others. And then finally, a discipleship is not about a perfection. It's about direction. There are no perfect disciples. Jesus was perfect, and that's why he's the teacher and the master. But all his disciples, all of his apostles were all men who had their weaknesses, and they had their shortcomings. And so to follow Jesus does not mean that we follow him flawlessly, but it does mean that a disciple keeps moving forward and that we don't draw back or that we don't fall back. So this evening for this devotional time, it invites us to ask at least an honest question, and that is, am I following Jesus? The invitation is still offered. Am I following Jesus? In Matthew the 9th chapter, in verse 9, I mentioned it a few minutes ago, that Jesus simply came up to Matthew and said, follow me. And it just says he followed. He just followed. One of the, in the TV series The Chosen, in one of the episodes, there was a scene there that really impacted me. There were a number of scenes that impacted me, but there was one that I thought was incredible. And it's one where Gaius, I don't know if you've watched the show, but Gaius was this Roman soldier. He's an officer. He has a lot of authority. And part of those that were under his authority and his watchfulness was Matthew. And there's probably good reason for it, because Matthew collected a lot of money, and a lot of that money was Roman money, okay? It was going to the Roman Empire. And so Gaius was going to make sure that this Jew, this tax gatherer, who had bad reputations of that day, that he made sure that this guy was flying right and keeping the books straight and that kind of thing. And so Gaius, over time, it seems as though Gaius starts to have a relationship with Matthew. It was a guarded relationship because he was a Jew, and Matthew was a Jew and he was a Roman, okay, a Gentile. But there was a sense in which Gaius respected the journey that Matthew was going to go on. And so in this particular scene, Matthew has been called. Matthew, when he's called, he just closes up everything. Gaius said, what are you doing? Because he just folds his book, shuts the thing down, goes through there, locks it up, and goes on. He's done, okay? And this shakes Gaius, because what is this guy doing? You're a rich man. You have lots of possessions. You have property. What are you doing walking away from this? And Matthew walks away from that, and that staggers Gaius and causes him to think, what's going on here? What is this thing about following Jesus that makes you do something like this? And in a particular scene, there's a discussion, and they're talking about all the complications of life. And they're talking about family, of which Gaius says, you know nothing about families, and Matthew says, well, yeah, you're right. I don't know a lot about families, but he says, my teacher, he makes everything simple. Matthew goes on and says, he goes, every day when I wake up, my ideas and my fears, they're all jumbled. I feel overwhelmed with doubts and regrets. But he says, but if I just pause for a moment and remember And Gaius says, what? Remember what? And Matthew says, I've only one thing to do today. Follow him. And everything else falls in place. I want you to think about how much peace that could give us. I'm sure that in here this evening, that all of us at one point, if not in the middle of it now, have our doubts. We have our fears. And there's times when our thoughts are all jumbled up and we're overwhelmed by so much that's going on around us. Maybe we need to do what Matthew said. He just pauses and says that, Jesus makes everything simple. All I have to do today is follow him. Follow him. And I think that's what was so attractive to the people who followed him in his day. He said, just follow me. Listen to me. Watch me. Watch my example. It'll be okay. So the invitation is still yours. It's still being offered this evening. And if you need to respond, won't you do so at this very moment while together we stand and while we sing.